I'm going to be reading an article which I wrote recently. It's published in Port magazine. It's called Literature from the Barrel of a Gun, and it's about the role of Palestinian literature in my life. On 28th of August, more than 65 Palestinian filmmakers signed a letter accusing Hollywood of dehumanizing Palestinians on screen for decades, a process that had helped to enable the ongoing genocide and devastation in Gaza. We are told all too frequently that literature and culture generally humanize the other, but cultural production can also prime people to allow for killing en masse. It can reduce people to targets, ungrievable bodies, dispensable others, stripped of history and humanity. When in doubt seems to be the unwritten dictum of Hollywood scriptwriters, just kill an Arab. And they do, over and over, in countless thrillers and action movies. Arabs portrayed in film continue, in the main, to be depicted as nameless, odoriferous, and duplicitous. None more so than the Palestinians, a national identity that for years has been repeatedly and deliberately fused with associations of terrorism. Around 14 million people globally have been characterized year in, year out through projects of cultural distortion as having no individual agency other than to cause harm. They are depicted as devoid of basic needs or desires, such as having jobs or families or falling in love. Instead, Palestinians are portrayed as a distinct species bred to kill innocents, making it, according to this perverse logic, justifiable to kill them before they do so. The heterogeneity of Palestinian existences continues to be flattened and denied. The most it seems to be allowed for in terms of political humanity is that of pitiable victims. As a reader who became a writer, I approached Palestinian literature from an awkward angle. I have an English mother and a Palestinian father, and I grew up in Kuwait, which as a teenager bored the hell out of me. Like many aspiring writers, my portal out of the ignominy of my unprepossessing surroundings was literature. I read only in English, particularly Russian and French classics, admiring works where the female protagonists had power and lovers most. Being Palestinian was nothing special in Kuwait at the time. Around 1 in 4 people in the country fell into that category before 1991, when about 400,000 were expelled. But the unhappiness my father's violent refugee experience brought to aspects of our family life felt, to paraphrase Tolstoy, like a very specific unhappiness, a private and wretched trauma, one that the world should know about but somehow could not be shared. When I moved to England at 16, it became even more of a secret hurt, rarely exposed. The word identity was not in my vocabulary, and my approach to wounds was to not lick them too much. Most Palestinian literature available in English at the time, and I'm talking about the 80s and 90s here, was produced by small publishing houses and consisted of poetry and rather mediocre translations of novels. At that age, I was rarely still enough in myself to be able to give poetry the focus it required. Mahmoud Darwish, the icon of Palestinian poetry, was a name I knew, but I assumed that he belonged to others, like the boys at school who wore keffiyehs. That all changed later when I read Ghassan Kanafani's Men in the Sun, which is a tiny collection of short stories. And in it featured Jaffa, Gaza, Kuwait. I was living in Cairo in my 20s, and I'd already lived and worked in Jerusalem briefly for a human rights organization. In these stories, I found my father's childhood in a house by the sea, expulsions from Palestine in 1948, become multidimensional and palpable, as did the world of the country where I grew up in. Rather than being escapist, literature became a way of discovering my core emotional fiber. It was a route of self-inquiry that was as self-affirmative as it was probative. In recent years, the quality, diversity, and quantity of Palestinian literature available to the English language reader has transformed and expanded beyond recognition. I believe that literature, together with art and films, both documentary and feature, coming from Palestinians in Israel, the occupied West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, the Arab world, and the broader diaspora, some of the most exciting, innovative, and challenging work available globally. It comes naturally to Palestinian writers to see the political in the personal, to make the personal political. Moral choices that pit the communal actions against the familial imbue every quotidian interaction. Characters are pressurized by states of siege. Actions have consequences. The stakes are incredibly high. Humor is valued and at stake. Freud, and I'm sure there are people in the room who know Freud better than me, but my understanding is that Freud recognized humor and altruism as the only positive psychic defense mechanisms for dealing with trauma and anxiety. And they abound in the worlds of Palestinian poetry and novels. For humor, I would direct the reader to the work of Mazen Ma'rouf's Jokes for the Gunman and Su'ad Amiri's Sharon and My Mother-in-Law. For altruism, it goes by another name, more one of a generosity of spirit and concern for others. It runs deep in the spirit of every line, with even the grieving, starving survivors of genocide, some of them living through genocide, struggling to find ways to help others. In Don't Look Left, A Diary of a Genocide by Atif Abu Saif, 2024, and Messages from Gaza Now, which was also written during the genocide, accounts by Hossam Mathoun, a playwright in Gaza from the period of the 7th of October 2023. If what we see in Gaza is a rehearsal for the future, as the Colombian president Gustavo Petro stated at a recent UN climate summit, then these are the works that demonstrate how to prepare oneself for coming times. In the past, it was my experience that literature translated from Arabic linguistically, but failed to translate culturally. This was not the translator's error. It was just there are regional variations in taste and behavioral codes. I always sensed that there was a higher degree of tolerance for what is deemed to be sentimental to those coming from a more puritanical Anglo-Saxon cultures, not to mention other variations in cultural norms, for example, with regards to women. Translators and publishers act as gatekeepers to another culture and are sensitive to and influence how people access those cultures. English language, how the English language reader is exposed to the subject. And these things are subject to fashion. And some of these trends, such as the saving Muslim women genre, are now dated and dismissed. Kudos should be given to the initiatives like ArabLit, which I would recommend you look up, and translators like Marsha Lynx-Quayle, Wenqing Ouyang, Alice Guthrie, Yasmin Seal, Catherine Halls, and others for pushing back on patronizing, politically motivated demands of publishers for veiled covered women on their covers, opening pathways for new voices and realities to come to the fore. When it comes to literary styles, there is no defining form in Palestinian literature. It's an eclectic, absorptive mixture of languages and global sources of inspiration. The Palestinian cause is an anti-apartheid quest for liberation. The post-Nakba trend, particularly in the 60s to 80s for art and culture, embodied the revolution. And Ghassan Kanafani was the epitome of the resistance writer. And I've actually heard Mahmoud Muna talking about him sort of barking down our throat. He's sort of like, what's expected, barking at our backs, like, you know, what's kind of expected. It's this sort of standard that we all feel inclined to sort of aspire to. He was assassinated in Beirut by the Israelis in 1972, together with his niece. At that time, the revolution the revolution that embraced cultural output was influenced by the legacy of Marx, Trotsky, and the Fourth Internationale. The battle was then, as it is now, not just for land and freedom, but against erasure at every level, from buildings to documentary records, archives, libraries, and photographs. Physical erasure of the Palestinians by Israel has now reached the heights of high tech, including, it's recently been reported, the mystical erasure of WhatsApp accounts of those killed in Gaza, the last remnants of relatives' voices and messages being eradicated with their bodies. The banning of Palestinian artists at festivals, the refusals of venues to host events, the censoring of content, the sacking of editors and of magazines that call for ceasefire. This too is erasure, not as visual or as physical as the destruction of over 500 Palestinian villages in 1948 or the destruction of every university in Gaza and over 200 archaeological and cultural sites, but another outrageous affirmation that Palestinians are not, according to powerful narratives, supposed to exist. Literature becomes a tool among many others to be innovatively deployed to write people back into life. And Palestinian writers and artists are responding to their threatened erasure and eradication with eloquence, style, and fury. Their writing ranges from the visceral and explosive to the contained and reflective. For work in English, one eye could be seen to be turned to the powers in the West, urging them to recognize Palestinian humanity, presence, history, complexity, interiority. This approach of writing, intending to quotes, inform the West, was one the Palestinian-born writer Soraya Antonius, who lived from 1932 to 2017, adopted in her novels of the 80s and then later questioned. Today, she wrote in 2001, I think that this was a rather colonisé reaction, implying as it did that Westerners were inherently godlike in their impartiality and that the injustice was born of misinformation. Style is not just a question of preference, but of circumstance. For those living under bombardment or occupation, or both, the short forms, and I'll refer you here to Nehru's Karmut in Gaza and Maha Abu Hayat in the West Bank, or the diary, Raja Shahada Atef Abu Saif, or the letter, Hussam Madhoun, can prevail. In exile, the Nakba generation, like my father, were frequently treated with incredulity when relating their history and identity. They wrote to recreate a destroyed world and took to their memoirs themes of exile, diaspora, and transit repeat for all Palestinians. For readers who feed off the delicacy, fine-tuning, and balance of a phrase, I would recommend the poets. Not just Darwish, but also Samih al-Qasim and Mossab Abu Toha. Palestinian novelists outside Palestine write in styles that have been compared to the epic-like remit of Stendhal, referring here to Isabella Hammond's novels, or the spareness of Raymond Carver, Adoniya Shibli. The young essayist Enes Nusaybi's namesake is a searing, contemplative account of, among other things, the microaggressions of racisms and Islamophobia experienced at a British university. Since the genocide in Gaza, a morbid genre of poems, probably unique, has emerged. Elegies anticipating writers' own deaths. Some call for no more than a grave, or to die in one piece, or not to wait for their own death for days under the rubble, as seen in these lines from a poem published on social media by Ibrahim al-Hula, hours before he was killed in an airstrike, together with his wife and 5-month-old baby daughter. I don't want to end up in a bag, he writes, with 2 exclamation marks. Everything is negotiable except for my death. I want a full shroud, 192 centimeters long. I don't want to give up any part of my body. I want it whole. It must not only be about death. Poet Rafif Ziada's We Teach Life, Sir goes to the heart of the battle. There is a desire pervading Palestinian writing to overcome destruction with humanity, community, family, and love. The urgency transmits. Palestinian literature refuses to accept that art is one thing and politics another. The fusion is as compelling as it is essential. In our tens and in our millions, as I say in demonstrations, we are all Palestinians. Thank you.